Welcome to the Crediting Meal Components Training Module presented by the Maine Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs. This presentation will cover the concept of crediting, or the meal pattern contribution of food served in the school breakfast and lunch programs. So what is crediting? In the school lunch program module, you learn that 5 food components must be offered with every lunch meal. When we talk about crediting, we're trying to determine the actual amount of a food component, such as a grain in this case, that is in a food product, such as a muffin. For grains, we're looking for the actual amount of grain in a food product. Let's take a muffin, for example. There are other ingredients other than flour. Therefore, a 2-ounce muffin is not going to equal a 2-ounce equivalent. So before we dive in, I wanted to start by listing some key concepts we will discuss during the presentation. This will include the difference between crediting a purchased product versus a homemade item, including the tools needed to determine the crediting of both. For grains and meat alternates, we will discuss ounce equivalents, which is the standard measurement to compare the grain and protein content of different products. We will also discuss the difference between volume and weight for the purposes of determining the meal pattern contribution. This is true especially for fruits and vegetables. I also wanted to emphasize that crediting takes time and practice, but it's an important concept for you to know. You'll notice on the meal pattern chart that the serving sizes are measured by cups or volume for milk, fruit, and vegetables. On the other hand, grains and meat alternates are measured in ounce equivalents or by weight. So what exactly is an ounce equivalent? So first we're going to look at grains when discussing ounce equivalents. Ounce equivalents is a standard measurement used to determine the amount of grain in similar food items. For example, both 1.25 cups of puff cereal and ½ a cup oatmeal equal a 1 ounce equivalent. We need more puff cereal to credit the same as a ½ cup of oatmeal. Oatmeal is more dense, and so less is needed to count as a 1 ounce equivalent. So with this standard, we can determine how much grain is in a variety of products, such as bread, pasta, crackers, and muffins. So what information and tools do you need to get this crediting information? For pre-made items, or items that you're purchasing, the Exhibit A grain chart is commonly used, which we will go into more detail. You can also use a manufacturer's product formulation statement, or PFS for short, a child nutrition label or CN label if one is available for that product. And if it's a USDA food, you could refer to the USDA Foods fact sheet. We're going to spend time reviewing the grain chart, and the others will be covered in the meat alternate section. Now for scratch-made items, you will refer to the recipe where you would calculate the total amount of creditable grain per serving. And we use the conversion of 6 grams equals a 1 ounce equivalent. Now let's review the Exhibit A grain chart. So the first step in reading the grain chart is to find your product on the left-hand side of the chart. Grain products are grouped based on grain content. So the lower the group, such as A or B, the higher the grain content. The second step is to look on the right-hand side to determine the minimum serving size to equal a 1 ounce equivalent. If we look up crackers under Group A, this tells us that a 1 ounce equivalent of crackers equals 22 grams or 0.8 ounces of crackers. You'll notice that they actually credit more than other products, and this is because crackers are more dense compared to some other grains. Now we're going to do a quick activity using the grain chart. Looking at the examples on the screen, which of these is a 1 ounce equivalent? We have 0.8 ounces of pretzels, a 2 ounce blueberry muffin, and a half cup cooked rice. So I'll give you a few seconds to come up with an answer, and I'll give you the correct answer. According to the grain chart, they're all a 1 ounce equivalent. Now there is an Exhibit A grains tool which does the math for you and calculates the ounce equivalents for different grains. And this tool is part of the web-based interactive food buying guide. So we'll go through an example. So it allows you to enter the product and the serving size in ounces or grams. So in this example, we chose a 3 ounce corn muffin. So you would enter the corn muffin, which is the description of the food item. You would enter the serving size of 3 ounces, and then it will calculate the grains contribution. So a 3 ounce corn muffin equals 2.5 ounce equivalents of grain. Now, for those of you who make your own bread or muffins from scratch, this is a method used to credit an item using a recipe. So how it works is you're converting the grams of grain in the recipe to grain ounce equivalents per serving. So the first step is to take the total grams of grain, which would include whole grain and enriched. Then you will divide by the number of servings in the recipe, and then you'll divide by 16 grams of creditable grain so that you can get an ounce equivalent. So as you notice, calculating grams of grain in a recipe involves quite a bit of math. If you're thinking you would like an easier way, the answer is yes. And this is by using your scale. So now that you've learned the difficult way, now we'll tell you the easy way. So for homemade grain items like breads and muffins, you can weigh the cooked item and check the grain chart. And either method will work, whether you're calculating based on the recipe or using the scale. You just want to make sure to be consistent with how you're doing it. So now we're going to discuss the rounding rule of crediting. And this applies to grains and also meat alternates. So you always want to round down to the nearest quarter ounce. So for example, after you do the math, you get 1.72 ounces. You would then round down to 1.5. On the other hand, 0.24 ounces is rounded down to 0, as a quarter ounce is the lowest amount that an item can be credited. So this item could not be counted towards any of the meal components. So let's talk about ounce equivalents in terms of meat alternate. There are a variety of protein items offered in the school lunch program, so we use ounce equivalents as a standard to compare different products. As you can see in this picture, 2 ounces of chicken nuggets or deli ham is not going to equal 2 ounces of meat alternate. These products have added water, fillers, and breading that account for part of the weight and not the protein content. And so this is why a child nutrition label or product formulation statement is needed, which we will discuss in more detail. On the other hand, whole muscle meat, such as chicken breast, after it has been cooked, credits ounce for ounce. So 2 ounces of cooked chicken equals 2 ounce equivalent of meat alternate. When crediting meat alternate, first ask if your product is a processed product or unprocessed. Unprocessed items include ground beef, chicken breast, or cheese. You will use the food buying guide to determine the cooked, edible yield of the product. If it's a processed item such as chicken nuggets, sausage, or deli meat, it contains additional ingredients such as breading and fillers. You will determine the crediting of these items by using a number of different resources. It could be a CN label or a manufacturer's product formulation statement. If it's a USDA food item, such as deli meats, you could get that through the USDA food fact sheet. You can also refer to the food buying guide, as some processed items are listed there as well. And it's important to note, if you cannot obtain documentation for processed products, you will not be able to determine the meal pattern contribution. So it's really important to keep labels, fact sheets, manufacturer's product formulation, and CN labels on file, which are used to support how your menu contributes to the meal pattern requirements. Here are some common meat meat alternates served in schools that all equal a 1 ounce equivalent. And we know this by referring to the food buying guide. This includes 1 ounce of cheese, as cheese credits ounce for ounce, 2 tablespoons of nut butter, 1.6 ounces of deli turkey, because there are added fillers and water that contribute to the weight, 1.2 ounces of deli ham, and 4 ounces of yogurt. Now we're going to move into some crediting resources that can help you. So as you plan your menus and have questions on how items contribute towards the meal pattern, these resources can be very helpful for you. And if you're unsure of how an item credits, you can also feel free to contact our office and we would be happy to help you with it. And so we've talked about the Exhibit A grain chart when discussing how grain products credit. So we'll move into talking about the food buying guide, child nutrition labels, and product formulation statement. So the food buying guide is a crediting tool, but it's also a great planning tool in general. It tells you the amount of food to purchase or prepare for a given number of servings. And because the food buying guide is now interactive, it also has a food buying guide calculator. So for example, if you would like to know how much broccoli you need to purchase for 100 half-cup servings, for example, it will do the math for you. And it's also important to note that an e-authentication account does need to be set up to access the tool. But once it's set up, you have free access to use the tool at any time. And the food buying guide can be helpful when looking at raw versus cooked weight for crediting purposes. Because with a raw product such as ground beef, you're going to have moisture and fat loss, which will affect the cooked yield of the product. And the yield information is helpful in determining how to get the cooked yield. For example, with ground beef that's no more than 15% fat, we see in column 6 that it loses about 1/4 of its weight when cooking. So how much meat meat alternate does a 2.5 ounce beef patty credit as? So in looking at column 6, we would take 2.5 ounces of a ground beef patty and multiply by 0.75. This would give us 1.875 ounces of cooked meat, rounded down to 1.75 ounce equivalents. Now let's talk about child nutrition or CN labels. If you're not already familiar with CN labels, you will be soon in the school nutrition world because they are highly used and sought after. With a CN label, the product has been evaluated by USDA to determine its contribution to the meal pattern. Manufacturers send their recipes to USDA to be evaluated so they can have this distinct label. And so you'll see them for Maine dishes that contain meat alternate and grain products, such as a pre-made pizza. And keep in mind that these are different than a nutrition facts label. So if we ask if a particular product carries a CN label, it's very specific and it looks like the label on your screen. And because CN labels are voluntary, not all products will carry one. So it's important when ordering products to check with the company you're buying from to see if a particular item has a CN label. Now here's an example of what a CN label looks like. They have a very distinct look, and you'll notice that they contain a border with CN written on all 4 sides. There's a 6-digit product ID number that's in the upper right-hand corner. They have a contribution statement. So for this item, it tells you that 5.64 ounces of fully cooked breaded nuggets provides 2-ounce equivalent of meat alternate and 1-ounce equivalent grains. It will also list a USDA/FNS authorization statement, and then the month and year of approval. So again, it's a very distinct look, and it's typically found on the boxes of the items that you purchase. Now, a product formulation statement is what you would request when a product does not have a CN label. It comes from the manufacturer and demonstrates how the product contributes towards the meal pattern. So in this picture, you can see the ingredients are all listed and then converted to a creditable amount. And it also includes a certification statement from the head of the company. Now, if you're not sure if your product has a product formulation statement or you're not sure how to read one, feel free to reach out to our office and we'll be able to help you out with that. So now we're going to move into the concept of volume versus weight. According to the meal pattern chart, fruits and vegetables are measured in cups or volume and not weight. This is important to keep in mind as 4 ounces of vegetable does not always equal a half a cup. So let's use baby carrots as an example. Weight and actual volume are very different. So if we were to weigh on a scale 4 ounces of baby carrots, it turns out to be more than 3/4 of a cup. And when we see 4 ounces written on a production record, we know this usually means a half cup serving. But it is important to record the measurement based on how it's written on the meal pattern. And this is because we compare the production records against the meal pattern, so it's important to accurately show what's being served to the students. Now, non-creditable or extra foods was discussed in the school lunch program module, but I wanted to mention it again just to reiterate these different foods. So not all foods can be counted as a meal component, and the ones listed here are some examples. These items are considered extra foods or thank you for coming, as they do not count as anything. And these non-creditable foods are determined by USDA. There are some foods that now credit in the National School Lunch Program that did not in the past. And these include popcorn, which now credits as a whole grain, corn flour or corn meal, which counts as a whole grain, surimi seafood as a meat alternate, tempeh as another plant-based meat alternate, and coconut can now count as fruit. So here are some takeaways from the presentation. We've talked about a lot of information up until this point. It's a lot of information to digest, but I wanted to mention these concepts as it might be helpful in kind of breaking down crediting in a little more easier way. So here are some key takeaways from the presentation. There's a difference in crediting a purchased product versus a homemade item. We talked about the concept of ounce equivalents for grains and meat alternates. Just because it is a 2-ounce muffin, it doesn't credit as 2-ounce equivalents of grain. We also discussed how volume and weight are different in terms of fruit and vegetable servings. And there are many resources available that can assist with crediting. So I would recommend becoming familiar with the resources that are available, such as the food buying guide, CN labels, and product formulation statements, which are used for processed items. And please don't hesitate to reach out to the Child Nutrition Office for assistance. We are more than happy to help you and want you to be successful. With that, this concludes our crediting meal components training module. I hope it was helpful and provided you with some tips to bring back to your schools. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.